My task in this session is to cover the history of the Earth in a few seconds. So it's going to be a little much. What I did in the film was they took out of 8 hours of videotape that they had of me 8 minutes to overview the history of the Earth. Well, they're asking me to extend it a little bit, but still it's going to have to be fast, and we're going to have to cover a lot. But first comment I want to make in this regard is that the biblical account of Earth history is finite. In other words, it isn't an infinite universe. It's a finite amount of time that the Earth has been in existence and will be in existence. It is linear. It is not cyclical. Its history is progressing on a particular path. It doesn't repeat itself in time, and it is planned. It's been foreseen by God. It's been planned by God. It is not accidental. Quite in contrast to other worldviews, views of history that have been proposed through time. Aristotle, for example, conceived of a universe without a beginning. So it's an infinite universe in time, an infinite Earth in time. And it's ultimately unchanging. It just never does change. It's a process. It involves process that continues in exactly the same way. That is not the biblical view of history. It's not as Charles Lyell envisioned Earth history. He's famous in geology. Perhaps outside of geology you wouldn't know his name, but he was influential as probably the most influential man in convincing the world that the Earth was in fact very old. But Charles Lyell's idea of the Earth was that Earth history was cyclical, that it is infinite, it has never had a beginning, and that it is continually recycling, coming back to the same form as it was before. This is similar to some of the views from Eastern religions that also feel that Earth history is cyclical in nature. And again, it's not the biblical view of Earth history. It's also not consistent, biblical view is not consistent with that, which was very popular in the 19th century, an idea of evolution, which had, yes, it's finite history, it's linear history, but it's improving. Evolution is improving organisms, evolution is improving our technology, and so on and so forth. The biblical view of Earth history is not like that either. The view of Earth history is that it is finite, it is not infinite, it had a beginning, it is linear, it doesn't repeat itself, and it is planned, and thus one might think, because of who planned it, that it is progressive, but it actually isn't. The period of Earth history that we're familiar with is a period, if anything, of decay that will ultimately be restored. And of course, naturalism has an idea that Earth history is unplanned, and the biblical account is quite different. It has been planned from the beginning, and it's something that's important to understand as we study it, as we try to infer the nature of it. And it begins, as I would read the scriptures, with the creation week. In 6 days, about 6,000 years ago, God created the physical creation. And he did it by what we commonly call in creation acts of special are events that are never repeated. This is again not a cyclical thing. This is a one-time thing. When he created the earth, and he's not going to recreate the earth. He might reform it, he might refurbish it, but he's not going to do the same thing again. He created all of these things in the creation week with unique processes. At the end of the creation week, he said, "That's it. It's over." He puts an end to the acts of creation. Creation ends, and the Sabbath begins, and the Sabbath continues. He has rested from his creation, from the creation week. He is still resting from the acts of creation. Those are unique to that particular week of time. But it's apparent, and it's implied in the text. I think the more we learn about science, something I'm going to talk about tomorrow, I believe it's also true that he created this universe in particular so that humans could, among other things, exist. That's a kind of a basic level, so they could exist. There's some other purposes. And thus, there's a very special kind of universe that he had to create to allow humans to be here, to allow humans to persist, to even exist for a moment requires a special universe. For them to persist for thousands of years requires an even more special universe. And it's a very special, planned universe for that purpose. It's also, though, beyond that, not just that humans exist, but that humans could know the God who created it, who could enter into intimate relationship with that God. I think of Peter Gentry's exposition of Genesis, especially Genesis 1:26 through 28, is excellent. I think it shows us that the image of God is created by God for a dual purpose of relating to God and ruling over the creation. It's a dual function. He created humans so that humans could do both. And in knowing God, it means knowing Him in the sense of increasing, ever knowing Him, ever more. It was originally intended that humans wouldn't be falling and doing all the stuff we're doing now, but Adam and Eve to think that they could continue forever in relationship with God, ever growing closer to Him, ever becoming more like Him, ever growing in knowledge of Him, ever becoming, as others would perceive them, more like God. Because God is infinite, that could happen forever. That's what He's created us for. He's created us for intimate relationship with God and to ever increase in our knowledge, our love, our understanding, and our similarity to God. We'll never become God. We cannot. He created us finite so that we cannot. But He created us infinite in age so that we can always get closer and closer to it. And because He's infinite, we can do that forever. It's really cool. We don't look interested in this. It's like, God, this is awesome. Okay. And so He didn't just create the universe so that we could be, so that we could exist. He created it so we could thrive. He created it so we could know, we could learn. There are attributes of the universe beyond what is necessary to exist, but necessary to know, to understand, to infer the nature of God, to know more about God. All of these are characteristics of this universe. Now, He had to create humans in a special way to do that too, but He's filled the universe with avenues, doors into knowledge of God. He says in Romans that He can, by looking at the creation, we can know the invisible attributes of God, even His eternal power and Godhead. The invisible attributes of God. God wanted us to know Him, but He's invisible. He wanted us to understand Him, but He's invisible. How does He do that? How do we know a God? We're so visually dependent. We're so sensory dependent, yet God Himself is unsensible. We can't sense Him. We cannot detect Him. He doesn't have to hide. He naturally can't be seen. He naturally can't be heard. In order to show His Shekinah glory, He has to create Shekinah glory. That's not His glory. He has to create it so that we can see it. He is naturally unseeable, undetectable, but He wants us to know Him. So He created this physical universe with physical illustrations of His invisible nature so we could understand His invisible nature from those things that are seen. Whoa, that's what the universe is. The universe isn't just a place where we live. It is a place God made. It's a temple God made for us to know Him and to know Him evermore every day of our existence. Included in that, skip some things here, not enough time. So we move into the first day of creation. About 6,000 years ago, okay, God creates the universe as a whole, the place, the space within which other things exist. But it's a special kind of space. It's three-dimensional. There's a lot of different dimensionality he could have put to he could have made it four-dimensional, he could have made six-dimensional. And it's probably, some have argued it's 10 dimensions with 7 of the dimensions collapsed so that they're very small. But it's 3 primary dimensions. And it turns out people that do these kinds of things, some people like playing crossword puzzles, some people like painting, other people like doing mathematical games. Like, what would it be like if the universe were 4 dimensions? What would things look like? Let's take the law of gravity and apply it to a 4-dimensional universe. The problem there is that the Earth can't go around the sun under those circumstances. The form of gravity, it will not allow for planets to persist in orbits, or for electrons to persist in orbits around nuclei. And it won't work in 5 dimensions, and etc. It only works in 3 dimensions. It could work in 2 dimensions, but 2 dimensions doesn't have enough complexity to allow for the complex molecules of which we are made. So there's only one dimensionality, it turns out, that where we could exist. And then there's this aspect of time. In the physical dimensions, we can go, in one dimension we can go up and down, the other dimension we can go up and down, the other dimension we can go up and down, no problem. But in time we can only go forward. We can only go in one direction. So he makes the space dimensions such that we can go either way in them, but time only one direction. And just like the issue of the three-dimensionality of space, if time could go both ways, if you could move both ways in space, you have this problem of you can't have stable planetary orbits, you can't have stable electron orbits, and so on and so forth. So he creates time, whatever that is, in such a way, the form of it, the basic form of it, so that we can exist, we can persist. And he also creates matter he's got a space for things to be in, and he's created matter. He's got subatomic particles which make atoms, but it's very special kinds of subatomic particles. I mean, there's dozens, scores of different kinds of subatomic particles, and they're fashioned in such a way as to produce these things we call atoms, which are fashioned in such a way as to produce these things we call molecules, which are fashioned in such a way as to make us possible. If the subatomic particles aren't made just right, we couldn't exist. So he's in that moment that he speaks the universe into being, the basic structure of space and time, the very nature of matter with the subatomic particles. Trillions of things are going on in his mind, thinking about everything that's necessary for making humans and the things that humans are going to see to perceive him. He's organized all of it. It's all, in a moment, created. And then the passage that people have struggled over so much, why he talks about let there be light. But the sun ain't created until day 4. What's going on there? What? Well, probably we suspect the reason he does it is he wants to demote the sun itself so that people won't worship it. They'll do it anyway. They do it anyway. They did it anyway. But think of what he does to the sun. The Egyptians worship the sun as, for most of their history, the premier god. But what does Genesis do to the sun? It strips the sun of its light, because there's light before the sun. And it doesn't make the sun on the first day or the last day, either one of which you might argue is, like the best. No, it's on the 4th day out of 6 days of creation. Could you demote it any more than that? It's not even halfway, like the third day. Puts it on the fourth day, strips it of its light, and it's like, guys, it's not something you should worship, okay? It's nothing. So the sun isn't there for a reason, but he wants light to be there. So where's the light from? Psalm 104 perhaps gives us a clue. First few verses seem to be in the same order as the creation week. And it opens with God clothes himself in light. Perhaps God himself functioned as the source of light for the earth until the sun is put in its place. And again, he isn't physical light. He created physical light to light the earth, and so he clothes himself in something he's created. Very possibly. Maybe, maybe not. Day 1 or 2, we don't know which one of these days these things are happening. We have somewhere in here the creation of the solid earth. We have reason to believe that the core mantle crust differentiation of the earth was already in place by the time of the flood. It was probably already in place in the creation. It's probably created by God initially. That it wasn't formed later. If you separate all of that, the heavy stuff from the light stuff, move it around like that, you release an enormous amount of energy that, well, unless God took the energy somewhere and took care of it, there's no way to explain it later in history. So most likely God created the core mantle crust structure of the earth in the creation week. But when? Did he create it when he said, let there be land? The earth begins with water, covered by water, but what's underneath? Is there land underneath? Is there solid earth underneath? Or is it created as water? An argument by Russ Humphreys, I think it's beautiful, it's elegant, it's pretty cool, is that God created all the bodies of the universe from water initially, creates them as that mass of water, and then orients the magnetic fields of each of those individual water molecules for that body then to have a magnetic field, and then he turns it into a planet, like he turned the water into wine, and the magnetic field that the water had created induces a motion of electrons to produce a magnetic field in the object. So he argued that that's how the sun got a magnetic field, and that's how magnetic stars got their magnetic field. That's how Earth got its magnetic field. And astonishingly enough, it's crazy, but if you calculate it, all the objects in the universe, there's a couple that I think are questionable as to whether they fit, but for the most part, 99% of the objects in the universe that I'm aware of, they have a magnetic field that's of the right amplitude to be explained this way. So perhaps initially God created the earth as that much mass of water, and then later at some point, when is that? Is that day 1? Is that later in day 1? Is that day 2? Is that sometime before day 3, or at least before the creation of land on day 3, but we don't know when? He then formed the solid structure of the earth. But in so doing, he created an earth of just the right mass, total mass, if it's total water mass or solid mass, to later hold just the right amount of atmosphere. If it's too weak of a gravitational field, it's going to release the gases that protect us from solar radiation and protect us from the cold of space. If it's too much mass, it holds on to hydrogen and helium, which are poisonous to us. So it's just the right mass to hold just the right atmosphere that he's going to create on the next day. And at the same time, it's got the right composition. There's a suspicion we have that perhaps the radiometric elements are important. Very possibly something happening at the fall that finally created the flood, actually resulted in the flood, may have been because of a particular distribution of radiometric elements within the earth. And God may have created the earth with those things in place so that when humans fell everything would be set in motion for the destruction that would become later. There's a magnetic field of a particular size that again is dependent upon the mass of the Earth that protects us again from the solar radiation. These and many other things, he's just, when he created the Earth, he created these things in place. Somewhere in here is the composition of the oceans, the saltiness of the oceans, the pH of the oceans, which is determined and maintained by buffers, which are sediments throughout the ocean floors, so that it would be just right for life. And perhaps at the same period of time, we're talking in creation biology about something called a biomatrix, which is a whole world of organisms that you do not see, microorganisms that dominate on this planet. Dominate in terms of volume, they dominate in terms of mass, they dominate in terms of numbers. Obviously, we're thinking that these little critters, bacteria basically, as you go deep into the Earth's crust, the volume and the mass of these organisms increases as you go down mile, 2 miles, 3 miles. There are more organisms, we currently believe, at, let's say, 10 miles beneath the surface, within 1 mile of that. If you add them all up, put them on a scale, there are more organisms at that level than there are on the surface of the Earth. If you weigh them, there are more. The Earth is full of organisms. Plants could not live on this Earth if it were not for invisible organisms that make it possible for them to live. Trees can't bring enough water into their roots to supply the needs of the plants. So there are special fungi that are created to draw in water. We can't digest many foods without microorganisms that are living in our intestines. Cows can't digest grass. It takes the microorganisms that are in their stomachs to digest the food and so on. The Earth is full of microorganisms that are there, have to be there, for plants and animals to exist. When were those created? Probably somewhere in here, probably in this creation of the oceans on days 1 or 2. He fills the oceans with quadrillions upon quadrillions of organisms that are preparing the way for the animals that will come. They produce the food that the animals will eat, that ultimately the whales will consume. There's a whole lot more. I just want to impress upon you the awesomeness of these acts of creation. In an instant, he created things that just, my word, just blow your mind. In day 2, he stretches out, it appears, the atmosphere. He places the atmosphere on the Earth, the right combination of oxygen and nitrogen. I mean, you put too much, it seems ideal we breathe oxygen. Surely you fill the atmosphere with oxygen. We learned in Apollo 8 that that's not a good idea. Once it fires, it burns, and it will burn everything out of existence. So we need just a certain amount of oxygen. We can't have too little, we won't be able to breathe. We can't have too much, we'll burn to death. So what do you fill the rest of the universe with, or the rest of the atmosphere with? You got to have atmospheric pressure to allow it possible for that oxygen to get into our blood, and so on. So we need the weight of that much oxygen, but we can't have that much oxygen. So he throws in nitrogen gas, which is basically non-flammable. It's a mass. It's something that gives the atmosphere weight and allows for breathing and so on. And it also contains the necessary nitrogen for our bodies. But alas, he's created the nitrogen in such a way that it can't combust, and therefore, guess what? We can't take the nitrogen and get the nitrogen out of it to use in our bodies. So he has to create organisms that are specially designed to take the nitrogen out of the nitrogen gas to give us nitrogen so that we could eat, so we could survive. It's just, and there's thousands of these kinds of things all over the place. Oxygen produces the ozone that protects us from the radiation. Wow. In creating the unit, you say, well, there's one day there, day 2. He doesn't seem to do anything. Just creates the sky. Big deal, right? It's not a big deal. It's a huge amount of complexity in the atmospheres of our planet, in the atmosphere of our planet, that allows us to not only live but thrive and persist for thousands of years. On day 3, we think he raises the continents. What he says is, let the waters be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear. What does that mean? Does he poof the water out of existence and instantaneously poof the land into existence? Or does he transform the water into land? Does he transform the wine into, or the water into wine? Or does he raise the continents out? Or are they already there, underneath the surface, ready to come up, and he raises them up? We think the third, because we've got evidence of sediments off to the sides of the continents that date from what we think are this period of time. So we think that God raised the continents. Also, it's interesting that in raising the continents, thus creating, in a sense, weak spots or faults, these are faults that are going to be reactivated during the flood and are going to determine exactly how things break up and where things go in the flood. So in raising the continents, I believe he orchestrated the nature of this present world, where the continents would end up. Even after they're moving all over the place during the flood, it ends up where they are now is determined by how he raised the continents in this period of time. Sorry about that. And then he raises the continents out of the water, produces huge volumes of sediment, in excess of thousands of feet of sediment on the edge of these continents, dries them and prepares the land for the animals that will come. Again, the organisms, the microorganisms that are going to be in there, the very specially designed ones to take nitrogen out of the atmosphere so that the organisms can use it, for the bacteria that are designed to mine nickel, bacteria that are designed to mine magnesium, individual magnesium molecules so that organisms could use them. Molybdenum. Do you know you need molybdenum? If you didn't have molybdenum, you would die. I didn't even know what molybdenum was. And we have protein, essential protein molecules that are based around one atom of molybdenum. And without that atom of molybdenum, those protein molecules wouldn't exist, and we couldn't exist. But you can chew on molybdenum all day long and never get molybdenum out of it. There's an organism, there's a bacterium that's designed to mine molybdenum out of the rocks and produce not just what they need, but enough for all the other organisms of the earth to use it. Just wild stuff. We're learning more and more that every single element we need for our existence, there's a specially designed set of organisms that extract that molecule, that atom, from the world around us, supplies it to us, and then returns it to the reservoir. And this cycle is ongoing for every single element that's necessary for our survival. If I don't get going, I'm not going to get finished here. Okay, so, and then also he creates the world he raises those continents in a particular configuration. What was that configuration? We don't know for sure. Our best guess this week is that it's in this, what we call a rodinia configuration of continents. This is really weird compared to the present. Here's a piece of Africa here. There's another piece of Africa up there. There's another piece stuck over here. There's India, Antarctica, Australia, China. North America is here, called Laurentia, Siberia, Amazonia, West Africa is over here. Pieces of the current continents are arranged in a very unusual order. This is an interpretation by non-creationists, which has never been properly evaluated by creationists. My suspicion is that if we reevaluated the evidence, because we would interpret it differently, that this configuration would be different in a creationist understanding of things. And I have a suspicion that there's a cool way in which it would be different. But in the current configuration, as it's currently understood, it's kind of a U-shaped continent. The rest of the world is ocean. There's the whole, so it's a supercontinent with one huge big ocean. And the area that's in blue here is continent covered by shallow ocean. So the implication we have from this is that the pre-flood world was mostly covered by water, shallow water, and marine organisms abounded on this planet. Very little of this part of the world was in fact covered, but it was actually land. So the brown is what we think this week was land. I have proposed in a paper a number of years ago that fringing this thing all the way around was a series of reefs to protect the continent from potentially storms and that sort of thing. The reefs, this is a hammer for scale, a human, Andrew for, no, that's probably me for scale, because Andrew took the photos. My photos didn't work from that expedition. But this is a mushroom-shaped, what's called stromatolite, made by microorganisms, made by bacteria. I believe this is an enormous reef surrounding the oceans formed by bacteria. Some of the reefs are a kilometer, 2 kilometers, 3 kilometers in size, made by bacteria. A little different world. Okay. Then, if you look at the creation account, you see a parallel fashion to the days. It says at the end of verse 2 that the earth was without form and void. It was formless and empty. And then for 3 days he gives it form, and then 3 days he fills it. So you have this is a problem, in a sense, set up by the Hebrew, and then the following days solve the problem, if you wish. They correct the problem, or if you want to call it a problem, the challenge or the description. So days 1 through the first half of day 3, we're forming, we're dividing, we're making shape of the creation. Then in the latter part of day 3 and on through the rest of the days, we are filling it with organisms. God creates plants on day 3. And with the plants, he's got to create a biomatrix that allows the plants to survive, special organisms designed to be with them. He created the plants in again, showing his very nature. There's a netted hierarchy of species. The organization of similarity is a reflective of his internal hierarchy. Hierarchy of God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. There's high diversity, reflective of the diverse nature of God himself. There's incredible disparity, big differences in organisms. Again, to emphasize both his three-person nature and the distinctness, the uniqueness, the absolute incomparability of God. And then there's hidden designs. You can't see it. If you looked at these plants at the moment they're created, you wouldn't see the thorns. You wouldn't see the protective tannins. You wouldn't see the poisons. You wouldn't see the things that would allow even plants to camouflage, because they're not necessary. They won't be necessary in this world until the fall. But all the information is built into the plants so that they're ready to go with that when that is necessary. They've also the information necessary to refill the earth after the flood is built into the plants. There's going to be plant morphologies, plant shapes, plant types that aren't needed in the pre-flood world. They're not going to appear until after the flood. There's going to be plants that are never seen on the earth until after the flood, but they're necessary to repopulate and prepare the earth again, to replant the earth, if you wish, after the flood. Those things are all hidden, are all in place, but are hidden in the organisms that are created. And then there's also plants created for human use. I mean, how do you explain plants that can actually decompose, break down plastic that didn't exist in the initial creation? God has created medicinal plants, plants that are going to remediate against poisons that we would create and put in the environment, but not for thousands of years. He's created plants ready to take care of that, ready to put that, that's all put into the initial creation. And then there's, of course, beauty in this, beauty reflective of the beauty of God. There's discontinuity there. There's classification of Brahman's created kinds and then classifications above it to reflect that discontinuity that exists between God and everything else. And there's mutualism. Plants are interacting with each other. We're learning more and more about how plants communicate with other plants. We're learning that a parasite hitting one plant, the plant communicates with adjacent trees through their root system and prepares the plants for the invader, so that the poor guy that got it first, the poor plant that gets it first gets nailed, but subsequent trees in the population can resist the invasion. It's amazing. And they're not just doing it one individual to another individual in the same species, they're doing it trans-species. There's cross-species communication going on in plants. There's interaction at extraordinary levels, and all this without any natural evil. So that, and he creates a diversity of communities in different parts of the world. There's reason to believe that on this is my suspicion, that this land is dominated by what we'd understand to be a gymnospermous flora. It's going to be the food for the organisms that live on that portion of the world, which are the dinosaurs, etc. And I've proposed that there's another continent-sized place, floating continent, special trees that are floating on the world's oceans that support a completely different set of plants. And then that leaves an interesting question. The fossil record of the flood is lacking some things. It's lacking humans. It's lacking mammals. It's lacking angiosperm plants, flowering plants, the plants that dominate on our present Earth, the plants you eat, the plants associated with human beings. So we're missing all the angiosperm, pretty much all the angiosperms. There's a few angiosperms in the fossil record from the flood, but very few. We had 250,000 species of angiosperms on the present planet. Where are they in the flood sediments? They're just not there. And we've got mammals. We've got 3,000 species of mammals. Where are they in the fossil record of the flood? They're almost non-existent there. Where are they? My suspicion this week, it's on a continent on the other side of the world that has been destroyed in the flood. That's, again, my suspicion this week. I don't know how else to explain these things, okay? Day 4, God creates the sun, the moon, the stars for light and life, measuring light. And so, but, you know, he puts the sun at the right distance and the right luminosity. And Danny has argued, I love it, that the sun may not be a star. It's specially created as our sun. There's no other star that could have, no star in the universe that could have done the job, because it's got such incredibly fascinating, unique properties. It's got a continuous supply of energy rather than pulsing energy, which is very common in stars. It doesn't have a partner star. It doesn't have a twin star. That would be really bad. If our Earth was going around our sun and then the other sun going around our sun would pull our Earth and they had this battle, we'd probably lose in that thing. So it's a very unusual star in the universe that is known as our sun. It's an extremely unusual moon in our universe. There's a lot of moons that we know of in this solar system, scores of moons in this solar system, but none of them, and some of them are bigger than the moon, but none of them are as big as the moon is compared to the Earth as those moons are compared to their planets. You got moons, big moons around the big planets, but they're tiny compared to Jupiter and tiny compared to Saturn. But the moon is huge compared to the Earth. Why? It helps in stabilizing the Earth's climate, stabilizing the Earth's orbit. It allows life on this Earth to persist. And then there's that amazing, amazing fact that the moon is distant enough, it got the right size, so that the sun, 93 million miles away compared to 240,000 miles away, have lunar eclipses and solar eclipses full of each. What's the likelihood that could ever happen? That's like zero. You're just not going to do that. And we're going to have a full solar eclipse coming up here, and it's because of the extremely unusual. Now, is that necessary for our survival? No, it isn't. But what we have learned from solar eclipses about the sun and about the earth is amazing. We wouldn't have known these things. That was put in place so that we could know, so that we could come to understand. And it would be cool and scare the socks off of some people. Perhaps there's a use for that too. Day 3, he creates water animals, air animals. And again, you need that biomatrix. You got all the characteristics I was talking about with plants. All these amazing things are created with these animals as well. And finally, oh yeah, and there's weird organisms. There's, I believe, just landward of this, the reef there is a strange set of organisms known as the Ediacaran fauna in the fossil record. They're described by paleontologists as being the air mattress world. They're like a whole bunch of air mattresses. They're flat. They look like they've been, like you've woven them together, so they look like they're kind of balloony with a tapestry, putting them together. It's just weird stuff. Some of them kind of look like jellyfish, but they're not. When you look at them, they're not jellyfish. They're just air mattress organisms. They're really weird. It looks like they're sitting just in landward of the reef, and they're one of the first things that are buried in the flood that is to come. And there are special critters that are created for this floating forest. Special critters that can actually live on the edge of the floating forest where it's too thin of a mat for normal organisms like you or I to stand or even to crawl. You need amphifish, fish that they can support themselves in the water, but they have legs so they can run along on the bottom, but they don't put enough pressure on the bottom that they fall through. And it explains the amphifish in the fossil record. Then there's an extraordinary variety of organisms created in this shallow sea world surrounding all over and as I said, most of these continents are covered by shallow water. 95% of the fossil record of the flood are these shallow marine invertebrate fossils. An amazing, beautiful, spectacular, mostly gone group of organisms that lived in that area. And then flying things would include, I believe, the pteranodon pterosaurs on the land. God creates the land animals. These would include on the floating forest, huge amphibians, dinosaur size amphibians, 12, 14, 15 feet long, that are keeping their body weight low, spread out, to live on a thin mat of vegetation, and the dinosaurs on the land. And again, where are the mammals? Probably, I think, on Atlantia, on the other side of the world. Sorry, I didn't say that. Then God creates Adam from the dirt. Okay, he reaches down and he creates human beings. He gets his hands dirty. Before this, he's spoken things into existence, and he could have spoken humans into existence, but he got his hands dirty. He reached down and formed yatzard, as a potter would make a pot. He yatzard man. He formed man. But it isn't just that. There's this incredible biomatrix. There's organisms living in us, hundreds of species of organisms living in us. As one of my professors said once, if you had an antibiotic acid that ate everything except nematodes, roundworms. Okay, if it just took a human being and just poured this acid, and he kept everything that didn't get decomposed, including bones, you'd suspend them right where they were, froze them in place, that you could see the entire human outline of the entire human body. You'd be able to distinguish all the organs of the body, and separate nematode species would identify each of the organs of the body. That's just nematodes. There's only 90,000 species of nematodes in the world, so it's just a small group. But you got bacteria, you've got all sorts of organisms, hundreds of species exist in our body, probably necessary for our existence, and we're coming to believe they're necessary for proper development of our body. as we're growing up. If we don't have the right microorganisms, our intestines don't develop properly, and so on and so forth. This is really cool stuff. He's created all this. We're a community. Our body is a community of hundreds of organisms interacting together. Looks like one. That's the way we're supposed to be. That's the way we're supposed to be in the church. That's the way we're supposed to be in our families. We're supposed to be many, but look like we're one, because that glorifies God, who is many and one at the same time. Sorry, I get excited by that. And it's created in the image of God, created with special abilities that allow humans to uniquely enter into that intimate relationship with God, and at the same time have the ability to rule over the things that are made, because God, before he created man, he says, I am going to make man to have dominion. Let us make man in our image after our likeness, and let them have dominion. He made us to rule. And so he made us with special qualities and abilities that have allowed us to rule. He gave us the ability to infer the nature of God from those things that are made. He gave us a desire to learn those things about God, and so on, so that we're created to be kings and priests in the creation. Kings over the creation, priests to interpret the creation, to fill our lives with worship, and to bring others into worship, to make the creation a place of worship. That's our function. That's what we've been created for. Then he creates the Garden of Eden. He plants the Garden of Eden. He makes to grow the plants of the Garden of Eden. Again, there's probably a space on the world after he finishes with the creation of Adam, and for the moment you looked at the world, there's probably one blank spot on the land. One place which is empty. No animals, no plants. It's Eden. It's going to be where Eden is. He creates man outside of Eden. Then he plants the Garden of Eden, and he places man into the garden whom he had made to take care of it, to tend it. And the two Hebrew words are juxtaposed there that are only juxtaposed elsewhere in describing the priests in their function in the temple: to keep and to maintain, to tend and to dress, is the same two words. We are to take the temple of God and to maintain it. That's what we were called to do. Then Adam is called to name the animals of Eden. There's so much in here I got to skip over. But he then creates Eve, especially designed, not because Adam was going to be lonely. It's because Adam alone, as one individual, could glorify God in many and extraordinary ways. But there's a few ways he couldn't. He couldn't show the multiple nature of God. He couldn't show the unified love of God for the members, the love that existed in the Godhead. He couldn't show the hierarchy of God alone. He needs another individual to bring even more glory to God. And uniting with that individual in marriage shows the love of God, shows the hierarchy of God, shows the diversity of God. And so she is brought in to help him glorify God, not for his purpose. Females are not made for males. Males are not made for males. Males are not. Humans are made for God, for the glorification of God, for the worship of God, for intimate relationship with God. And females were brought in to help in that, to increase the glory of God that would be brought to God by proper behavior. And then God ends his creation. And by that he means he stops all of these special creation events. Never again. They're done, and he enters into rest. And in Hebrews chapters 3 and 4, he encourages us to enter into his rest that still continues. He did his work in 6 days and rested. We don't have to do the work. In fact, if we do the work, we ain't going to do as good a job as he would. So we let him do the work, and he is glorified in the process. Sorry, that's another topic. We slide into the next period of Earth history, the Edenian epoch. It is described as very good. He looked at everything he had made, and behold, it was very good. It is a world you might describe as shalom, peace. It's a world with no biological evil, no geological evil, no climatological evil. There's no natural evil in the world at all. There's integration and beauty. There's mutualism, no parasitism. There's life. There's no death of nephesh life. Humans or animals did not die, could not die. Animals and humans ate plants. There's no carnivory. There's health. There's no disease. There's developmental aging. You could grow from a little tyke to an adult, but you are not going to degeneratively age after that. There's no over-the-hill stuff. Once you get to the top of the hill, you're at the top of the hill for eternity. Okay? Like it's going to be in the creation to come. And creation is sustained indefinitely. That means the sun somehow got to burn forever. Interesting. Somehow the processes which now run down, which run out, and the things age, somehow it was originally created to persist forever, which has to be the case, because that's creates our new bodies. They've got to persist forever. That's got to be a possibility. So this is the state of that world. How long was this? We don't know. Somewhere between a few days, enough time to sort of become used to this enough that it looks like God walking in the cool of the day is a usual activity. And yet, how long? Well, we know that Cain and Abel are conceived after they're out of the garden, and Cain kills Abel. So whatever the age of Cain was at the murder of his brother, you can subtract that time out of. Adam is 130 years old when he begets his son Seth. So if they're 70, it could have been there in the garden for 60 years. We don't know. We just have no idea. I kind of like 7 years, just good number. But I don't know. This is a period of time that becomes a normative for us. It is the way God intended the world to be. It is a standard we can use to determine ethics in the present world. The Edenian epoch ended suddenly with a curse, and it's God's response to the fall of the king. The king of the creation sinned. The creation was cursed. Human sin did not cause the curse. Humans didn't cause the curse. God cursed his own creation. God responded to man's sin by cursing the kingdom over which the king presided. So we see this in the history of Israel. When the king is following God, Israel is blessed. When the king does not follow God, Israel is cursed. Okay? Then the king of the creation falls. Then God curses the kingdom of the king. And at this point, God changes how he sustains the universe, how he holds the universe together. No longer is the sun going to burn forever. It's going to burn out. Okay, billions of years from now. But, there's some things that are going to burn out more rapidly than others. There are these cycles, different cycles that existed before the fall are now broken. Cycles that would have been forever are now broken. And I suspect big cycles, when broken, give us in the perception a concept that the earth is very old. And cycles which were very short, broken, give us the idea that the earth is very young. And it's all the breaking of all these cycles at that point that begins a time clock, if you wish. Most of the processes we use to determine the age of things are degenerative processes that began at the fall. They were part of processes which were ongoing and cyclical before the fall. Biological repair is apparently just slightly less efficient. On the average, the likelihood of a mutation at any given nucleotide site in the human DNA is 1 in a million. That's an amazingly good copy record. I mean, you copy a book, you only make one mistake in 1 million characters. That would be impressive, very impressive. Printing presses don't even do that, okay? And so it goes from perfect to slightly imperfect, so that over the millennia, mistakes, errors enter the system and gradually degenerate the system. But he didn't allow so much error that the system crashes. He didn't allow so much error that it no longer showed the beauty of God. He didn't allow enough evil so that his glory could not be seen through the creation. He restrains it. He holds it back. He only brings in just enough to allow human history to exist for as long as it needs to exist, and still every human being see the very character of God in this. Then he introduces death, not as a bad thing, but as mercy. It's a bad thing if the earth hadn't been cursed, but after the curse, when we are now degenerating, every day we get up with more pain than the day before. Every day we are feeling more of the effects of disease or whatever than the day before. In a world like that with no death, that's, shall I say, hell. That you would forever and ever and ever be suffering more and more and more. So that God says, lest man take of the tree of life and live forever, now that the universe is cursed. I'm going to kick him out. I'm going to introduce death as mercy. It is an evil in a world without a curse, but with a curse, it is a blessing. It's mercy. God is limiting the evil in the world by introducing death. But once he introduces death, now the organisms that only reproduced a certain amount to increase their numbers to fill the earth are now going to have to replace those that die. So they're now going to have to, he ramps up the reproductive capacity of organisms. So now they're reproducing more rapidly. Before the fall, how long do you think it would be before Adam and Eve would conceive of a child? Most people think, well, it's a perfect world. It's going to be boom, going to be immediate, you know. Really? If they're going to exist forever, maybe God wanted us to have a baby every 1,000,000 years. He wants us to fill the earth, but he didn't say how long. Could it have been 1,000,000,000,000 years that he wanted the earth to be filled? Could you go for 1,000,000 years before you had a baby? Could you go 3,000,000 years, 1,000,000,000 years before you... Would it matter? It wouldn't matter in an eternal universe, okay? But at the fall, once the fall occurs, death is occurring. You've got to reproduce fast enough to replace those who die, in addition to the fact that you're supposed to fill the earth. So now organisms overproduce. They produce more offspring than can survive to adulthood and produce new offspring. As a consequence of that, then we have competition. Now organisms are competing with limited resources. Now you are introducing natural selection. Natural selection was not a phenomenon before the fall. Natural selection is differential death as a consequence of the struggle for survival in a world where you've got too much production and too few resources. So natural selection now comes into the scene. Predation is introduced into the world, not as an evil, although it would have been an evil before the fall. It is after the fall, the predators are preferentially taking out those who are suffering the most. They're decreasing the total evil in the world and making the world healthier than it would otherwise be. So likewise with natural selection. And then God opens up or reveals those defenses that he put into organisms from the beginning. So now organisms hide from their predators. Now organisms have protective measures from their predators. All this gets revealed immediately or in time. We don't know exactly because we have very little information from that point to the beginning of the flood. The antediluvian epoch then begins at the curse. It's about 16 and a half centuries of time. It is referred to as the world that then was. It's on the other side of the flood. It's antediluvian. What about this world? One thing, there are more critters and plants on this world. Some of its differences from the present. There are more created kinds. Brahman is the word for created kinds. For example, there's at least this many more created kinds in the pre-flood world than in the present. In the fossil record, we have all of these organisms that we do not have today. And these are just the orders, classes, kingdoms that I know of in the fossil record. This is not a complete list. Just to make the point, as diverse and as amazingly diverse as life is in the present, It was astonishingly more diverse in the pre-fall world, in the world after the fall, before the flood. There were different ecosystems, unique ecosystems. There's bacterial reefs that live in a hot water environment. There's these, the mattress organisms, completely different, a floating forest. These are things we don't see in the present. The world would have probably had all the ecosystems we have in the present, similar to it, but many more besides. It was a bigger world, a more beautiful world. Warmer world, wider tropical zones, no ice, cool temperate poles for reasons I can't get into. Humans didn't eat meat. Humans lived more than 900 years, and that's probably nothing to do with the environment. Absolutely nothing to do with the environment. It's probably genetically programmed for them to live 900 years, and then that program was adjusted then at the flood and following that. And I suspect there's a world that's degenerating, that's deteriorating in the flood. The typical old creationist idea is the pre-flood world was quiet and there were no earthquakes and there were no volcanoes and it was no fossils formed and it was a quiet world and nothing changed. But that's not what the indication is in Scripture. First of all, we're told that there's an increase in evil, so that all flesh corrupted itself upon the earth by the time of the flood. Nephesh, flesh. Not just humans, but apparently animals. Not just were humans killing one another, but apparently animals are indiscriminately killing each other, which might explain why in the fossil record I find incredible degrees of disease and terrible, mean things that animals are doing to other animals. Every dinosaur specimen that we reconstruct has multiple tumors. And these are only the ones that are evidenced on the bone. I don't know how many more weren't evidenced on the bone. Multiple tumors and multiple broken bones. And many of them have the embedded teeth of predators. Even the predators themselves have embedded teeth of predators in their bones. That's not the ones that were embedded in flesh that wouldn't show up in the bone. That's just the ones that are in the bones. What's going on? Why would a stupid predator break his teeth off in the bones of another animal and not kill him? They're just being mean. There's evidence that organisms are just being downright mean and cruel and hateful to other organisms in this world leading up to the flood. There's an increase in work and food shortage. 600 years before the flood, Noah's father names him Noah because in his days we shall find rest from our toil. Apparently it's getting harder and harder to raise food, probably because God is punishing murder in the same way that he punished Cain's murder, so that every murderer has the ground poisoned wherever he goes or she goes, so that by the time of the flood, all the land was poisoned. And it's very difficult to find, so that God says after the flood, I will no longer again curse the ground for man's sake. So you got this deterioration in economy and all of this leading up to probably from our understanding of geology, I think that there's an incredible increase in earthquakes. I think leading up to the flood, we have thousands of feet of sediment being formed at the edges of continents where they're about to break to begin catastrophic plate tectonics. And probably earthquakes began to be a daily occurrence in that pre-flood. The whole world was falling apart. It was very clear that something was about to happen. Get in the ark, you dodos. Okay, but they're dodos. They didn't get in the ark. And then the flood. I have no time, right? Oh, my word. Yeah, okay, the flood. It wiped everything out. It happened quickly. It happened very quickly. In a year, everything was gone. Everything is rearranged. The continents are moved around in diverse places. The world doesn't look the same at all. Humans got onto the ark looking at one kind of world, familiar with where food was to be grown, where iron was to be mined, where gold was to be mined. They got off the ark. Nothing. that they recognize. Thousands of feet of the continents were shaved off, and then thousands of feet of sediment were deposited on top of the continents, and the continents were broken apart in pieces and moved all over the place. No clue where anything is after the flood. Okay, so people get off the ark and go, what on earth? This doesn't look anything like where we came from. And they're scared. They're terrified. They stay in one place. They stay in Babel while the earth is settling down, while there's incredible things going on. Yeah, the flood was monstrous catastrophe, but the catastrophes followed the flood for years afterwards, for centuries following the flood. There were catastrophes of astonishing magnitude. Earthquakes that would dislodge mountains from their base, break mountains off of their base on either side of the San Andreas Fault, and bounce them across the landscape for 20 miles, 40 miles, 60 miles in either side of, so bouncing them away from the earthquake zone. That is nothing like the present, okay? This is enormous earthquakes. We think there are possibly storms, hypercanes, the size of continents that stayed over places on the earth for a century and pulling up, basically vacuuming up warm water from the oceans and cooling the oceans and dropping down enormous precipitation to produce huge lakes, such as the lakes above the bow in the earth that is above what is now Grand Canyon, enough water that would eventually overtop those dams and create the canyons of the earth. Eventually it gets cool enough that the precipitation comes down as snow in probably under two hypercanes on opposite ends of the earth. It comes down as snow to create miles, literally miles of ice. That then once the oceans got cool enough, the hypercanes broke up. The ice is too thick to support itself under its own weight. It basically surged out in a decade or two, making its way to the south in the northern hemisphere, across the oceans in the southern hemisphere, and then melted back. But once it melted, it's fresh water in the glaciers. Fresh water floated over the oceans, especially over the Arctic Ocean, and froze. If it was salt water, it probably wouldn't have frozen. But because it was fresh water, it froze. The ice reflects light into space and temporarily, for a few thousand years, slowed down the cooling, the melting of the glaciers. And now it's continuing. Those glaciers will disappear. All of that ice will disappear. Global warming is a real phenomenon. It's all recovery from the flood. All the earthquakes, all the tornadoes, all these things are artifacts of the flood, leftover remnants of the flood, reduced intensity volcanoes, earthquakes, and everything else from the time of the flood. The earth is still recovering. Geologically, we're still in the flood. We're still seeing the effects of the flood. That's the story. Yeah, okay. I guess I've got to stop there. Did I have any other cool things? No, I didn't. I went way over time, so I've got to stop it at that. So thank you.